The hypothesis emerging from the latest developments is that the intermittent nature of the Iran-US-Israel conflict increasingly serves Washington and Israel better than either an all-out war or an early settlement. Reports that CENTCOM recommended halting further strikes around the Strait of Hormuz after their military effectiveness had largely been exhausted fit this pattern. A pause does not necessarily signal de-escalation. It may simply mark the end of one phase until renewed military action offers greater strategic or political utility. More importantly, intermittent conflict is helping Washington and Israel establish a regional narrative about Iran that years of Western diplomacy struggled to sell convincingly. Israel has long argued that Iran's nuclear program, long-range missiles, and regional network threaten not only Israel but the wider Middle East. Gulf states understood these concerns, but increasingly prioritized economic development, regional stability, and accommodation with Tehran over confrontation. The conflict is changing that calculation. Iran's ability to threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz demonstrates its leverage over Gulf economies and global energy flows. Its missile and drone capabilities, alongside its regional network, show that escalation involving Iran need not remain confined to Israel. Consequently, Iran's strategic capabilities increasingly appear to the GCC not merely as an Israeli security concern, but as a direct challenge to Gulf security, energy exports, investment, and economic stability. The intermittent nature of the conflict reinforces this perception. Continuous warfare eventually generates pressure for a ceasefire. Repeated cycles of escalation, pause, and renewed escalation instead keep regional vulnerabilities visible without necessarily producing the political costs of permanent warfare. Each episode reminds GCC states of their exposure while allowing Washington to reinforce its position as the principal external security provider capable of containing Iran. Tehran's own actions may therefore be accomplishing what Washington and Israel could not achieve through persuasion alone, gradually aligning GCC threat perceptions more closely with their own. There's also an immediate political dimension. Netanyahu faces elections without an easily definable victory. Iran remains intact, its political system survives, and its nuclear and missile capabilities have not disappeared. Ending the conflict without a demonstrable strategic outcome would invite questions over what Israel actually achieved. A prolonged but controlled confrontation allows Netanyahu to postpone that judgment while redefining victory from defeating Iran to continuously degrading and containing it. The constraint is Israeli casualties. Netanyahu requires the Iranian threat to remain politically visible without Israeli society bearing unacceptable human and economic costs. If Iran continues avoiding major direct attacks on Israel while confrontation persists elsewhere, that balance becomes easier to maintain. Iran remains the threat, while Israeli deterrence can be portrayed as preventing Tehran from striking Israel directly. Trump faces a different calculation ahead of the US midterms. Continued confrontation allows his administration to project military dominance, demonstrate commitment to Israel, and consolidate support among strongly pro-Israel constituencies, including important Republican donors and evangelical voters. But an uncontrolled conflict around Hormuz risks higher oil and gasoline prices, renewed inflationary pressure, and economic dissatisfaction before the elections. This produces a convergence of political interests between Washington and Netanyahu. Netanyahu needs enough conflict to avoid having to explain an inconclusive victory. Trump needs enough conflict to demonstrate dominance without allowing disruption in Hormuz to trigger an oil shock before the midterms. But there may be a stronger political incentive for prolonging a controlled confrontation. Keeping strongly pro-Israel Jewish constituencies, donors, and advocacy networks firmly aligned with him and the Republican camp. Maintaining pressure on Iran allows Trump to present continued US backing for Israel as both strategic commitment and political resolve. If that support is considered critical to the midterm electoral calculus, sustaining a manageable conflict could outweigh even some economic costs from higher oil prices, provided escalation remains controlled. The politically useful outcome for both may therefore be neither decisive victory nor immediate peace, but controlled instability. Escalation when useful, pauses when costs become excessive, negotiations without necessarily producing a final settlement, and sustained pressure on Iran. In such a conflict, pauses should not automatically be interpreted as signs that the war is ending. They may increasingly be part of how the war is being managed.